The Rocky Mountain Altitude Powerplay Carbon 70 is, to date, the best e-bike I've ever ridden. And that's for three really important reasons. First off, the geometry. Second, the motor. And third, the kit that's plugged into it. These are the three most important elements of any e-bike, but it seems that Rocky Mountain have got each one pretty much spot on. The main headline geometry-wise about the Altitude Powerplay is that it has exactly the same geometry as the Altitude and the same pivot placements. A lot of other e-bikes have had to make some compromises on geometry in order to fit the motor and the battery into them, so generally speaking that means a really long back end. Rocky Mountain have worked with a company local to them to create their own motor, and thanks to that it means that they don't have to run a super long back end. In fact, the chainstays are 426mm, which for an enduro bike or a trail bike is actually really short anyway. So having an extra chunk of weight in the middle of your bike, some might say that it's going to feel a bit weird, and there is a difference between the two bikes. But if you are going to have some weight plugged into the bike because you want an e-bike, having it around the BB, which is where the motor on the Altitude Powerplay is, that's exactly the right place for it. It's low, it's central, and it means that when you turn the bike into corners, it holds the line really well. If we're talking about bike handling, the other interesting thing about having an e-bike versus a normal bike is the ratio of sprung to unsprung mass. If you've seen Seb's video on his weight experiments, then you'll know what we're talking about. If you haven't, there's a link just up above here. But it's worth watching because it kind of changes the characteristics of how a bike handles. What's been really interesting for me is that I've also had the non-E version of the Altitude at exactly the same time. So I've been riding them back to back, one trail on one bike, the next trail on the other. And it's really noticeable how different the suspension is between the two bikes. The added motor and battery just makes the bike super smooth, confident, stable. Yet it's a little bit harder to pick up and place over roots and rocks. But on the whole, I'd actually prefer descending on this bike in a little way. It has the same shape, but the suspension feels better. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why I really like the Altitude Powerplay, is that I really enjoyed the descents. I have always enjoyed descending on e-bikes, but for me, their real utility is, the number of times I can do a run in a day is increased over a normal bike because I'm not getting tired so much from the climbs. But this is the most involving, most fun and enjoyable descending e-bike I've ridden. So let's move on to the second reason why I think this is, to date, the best e-bike I've ridden, and that's the motor. So how it differs is the way that the motor recognises that you're putting in pressure to the pedals. Instead of having regular sensors in the bottom bracket or in the cranks, they've developed an idler wheel system which is based on chain tension. What this means is that power delivery is basically instant, and one of the criticisms we've had of other motor systems out there is that sometimes there's a bit of a lag between power delivery. The flip side of that perhaps is that on smooth fire road climby drags you get a little bit of pulsing, and that's because when you're pedaling through the cranks, the power that you deliver to the pedals isn't consistent in the full circle. It peaks sort of between say 2 and 5 o'clock on the clock face. And this is mirrored a little bit through the drive into the motor. Is it a problem? Not really. On technical terrain, you don't really notice this anyway, and it's only on smoother fire road climbs that you might notice it. Perhaps from a long-term usability point of view, the trump card of this motor system is that pretty much everything in there that can wear can be easily replaced. So, unlike on the Bosch or the Yamaha or the Shimano, you've got a replaceable bottom bracket. It's a standard PF92 BB, so you can swap that out at home. It runs on a regular race face crank with a regular spacing, and you can use a regular chainring on there. The little pulley wheels and jockey wheels inside, they're all user replaceable as well. You can look inside it by taking the plastic faceplate off on both sides. You can remove the motor with 3 bolts. You can remove the battery as well. Speaking of the motor, a regular e-bike generally has around a 500 watt-hour battery plugged in there. Rocky Mountain have integrated the battery into the down tube, and this one's a little bit bigger. It's 632 watt-hours, so you get about 20% more capacity out of it. Perhaps one of the downsides though is that to charge it, it has to be charged in the bike. So if you haven't got a plug point in your garage or your shed or whatever, you have to bring the bike into the house to charge it. The kit that's plugged into the frame is the third reason why I think this is the best e-bike I've ridden so far. And you'd kind of hope so for £6,500. You get a Fox 36 Performance Elite in its e-bike specific chassis, so that's a little bit stiffer. The Elite bit of that means you do get the Fit 4 damper, and this performs, generally speaking, a little bit better than the performance kit we've seen from Fox recently. At the back you've got a Fox Float DPS Evol Performance Elite shock, and as you'd expect, with that improved sprung to unsprung mass ratio, it all feels really good. Moving on to the wheels, you get really nice 40mm internal width rims with Maxxis 2.5-inch WT Minion tyres. So the WT is their wide trail stuff. It's built around that wider carcass and the wider rims. It's a really good carcass, it's a really good construction of tyre. They don't flop about all over the place like some of the wider 2.6 or 2.8-inch tyres can do, especially on an e-bike, so dead chuffed to see these here. You get SRAM Guide RE brakes. These are the e-bike specific brakes from SRAM, and they come with 200mm rotors front and back, so this thing absolutely hauls to a stop when you pull on the anchors. The whole thing is driven along by SRAM's EX1. So this is an e-bike specific group set with an 8-speed cassette at the back. That's got a 10 to 48 tooth range. Personally, I'd rather see a regular 11 or 12 speed group set in there. I find the jumps between the teeth is a little bit big for my tastes, so it constantly feels like you're changing cadence when you shift between gears. I've waxed lyrical a little bit about this bike, and as you can probably tell, I actually really enjoyed it, but it's not perfect, so I'm going to be a bit critical now. I've already mentioned the pulsing from the motor, which some people might not like. Earlier on I mentioned the 426mm chainstays as a positive, and generally speaking I think it is. It's got one downside though. On steeper, more technical climbs, when you've got a lot of power going through the drivetrain, you have to be really conscious of keeping your weight further forward, because the front wheel goes really light and it can lift off the ground quite easily. It maybe isn't the best at turning, so that short back end is a bit of a double-edged sword. It makes cornering and descending a lot better, but it makes real steep technical climbing not quite so easy. At £6,500, not many people are going to be able to buy this bike. It's really expensive for what it is, but it is great. If we can get e-bikes that have really sorted geometry, where it isn't compromised so much by the motor, I think we're going to see a lot of amazing, really well-riding e-bikes coming out. So hopefully this is a sign of things to come. Hopefully bikes are going to get more integrated, better riding, but also we hope that they're going to come down in price a little bit.